Ons was dienspligtiges en standemag, die manne en vroue, die hele SAW en seunsbroederskap, wie vanaf die 60er, deur die 70er en tot die 80er jare op die grens en elders ons mense probeer verdedig en beskerm het. Om die kampvuur gesels ons oor die lag en die huil, die stap en die hardloop, die drill en die marcheer, die oefen en die ontspan, die werk en die speel, die sweet en die rus, die vasbyt en die jiphou, die val en die opstaan, die baklei en die weghardloop, die suksesse en die mislukkings, maar ook die bloei en die doodgaan, die treur en die wroeging en veral die onthou. Ons onthou ons helde en gevalle makkers en die gewone soldate en polisiemanne, van troep tot korporaal tot sersant tot offisier, wit, swart, bruin en geel, wie saam onder die oranje, blanje, blou gedien het in Suidwes en Angola, in Rhodesia en Mosambiek en in Suid-Afrika self. Om die kampvuur vertel ons hulle stories, maar laat ons hulle ook self terugdink en pyns en onthou. Om die kampvuur, aangebied deur Willem Ratte.
Goeienaand luisteraars. Weer nog 'n om die kampvuur vanaand. En hierdie keer so baie ander kere met ons manne wat op die grens was oral. Is dit iemand wat oorspronklik van Suid-Afrika afkom? En toe het die lewe hom gevat Rhodesia toe en baie ander plekke toe. So ek dink jy sal dit interessant vind waar die lewe hom oral heen geneem het. Kom ons stel hom voor. Mike, good evening.
Hello, Willem.
So, your family came from South Africa,
Yes.
Benoni at some stage as well. Tell us where they come from and how they ended up further north.
Well, my father and his brother returned from the Second World War to South Africa, and they had grown up in Pietermaritzburg, where they met two sisters of the same family. Now, my father and his brother were born in Greytown in Natal. When they were very young, their father passed away and they were subsequently relocated to Pietermaritzburg. And more or less the same thing happened with my mother and her sister. They were born in Benoni, and again, the father was lost when they were very young to illness, and they relocated to Pietermaritzburg. So yeah, after the Second World War, my dad and his brother met my mom and her sister. My dad obviously married my mother, Ruth, and my uncle, my dad's brother, Uncle Paddy, married Jean, the sister. Paddy and Jean decided to emigrate to Rhodesia back then. Would have been around about 1948.
The promised land.
Where they set up, they set themselves up in Salisbury, in Rhodesia, and found that there was so much potential there that they convinced my father and my mother to move up to Rhodesia and join them. And this, of course, happened. So I was born there, and my brother a couple of years later. We were born in Rhodesia. Went to school in Rhodesia, grew up there, and ultimately leaving Churchill High School, I joined the army for want of any better ideas of employment, and also knowing that national service was now a requirement in any case. And yes, well, the fact was that I also was at that time very keen on shooting sports and ammunition collecting and such like things, and I thought the military might be good fun. So I volunteered to do my national service soon after I left school, and duly reported to Llewellyn Barracks in Bulawayo.
What year was it?
That would have been the end of 1970, beginning of 71. And yes, so I was sent to Llewellyn Barracks, and I started doing my basic training, basic infantry training, with 2nd Battalion, the Rhodesia Regiment, A Company. And about a month into the training, along came a recruiting team from the regular army in the form of Captain Harvey and a few other members of C Squadron Rhodesian Special Air Service. I had also long had an interest in flying and anything to do with flying, but I couldn't go to the Air Force because I had not done well at maths during my high school years. So I was very taken with the offerings of the recruiting team from the SAS, and I duly volunteered to go to Salisbury and sign up with the regular army for a 5-year contract. And yes, then, of course, as you'll be aware, you don't simply sign on and be accepted into the SAS. It's a total of about a 6-month selection period, which includes 3 months of basic infantry training, 3 months of, or I should say, right at the beginning, of course, there's a week-long selection course, which in my case was in Inyanga, in the mountains. And from there, we completed our basic training. We had about a week-long exercise to prove our skills at the end of basic training. Then we went into specialist SAS training, such as troop medics, basic demolitions, rock climbing, diving, all at a basic level, mind you. And which ended up about 3 months later with exercise all in. Again, an exercise to prove your endurance, your mental fortitude, and your ability to think and act with a reasonable degree of, how can I say, independence to achieve your objectives. And at the end of that, if you passed exercise all in, you were basically pretty much accepted for SAS and the final phase of the training, which was the basic static line parachute training course.
Tell us about the all-in, because that was quite interesting, wasn't it?
Well, the all-in exercise was a hypothetical situation where you were supposedly sent to infiltrate enemy territory with the assistance of certain partisans. And of course, you're given different objectives day by day and night by night to reach and achieve, and to meet up with your partisan assistants, who in one point of the exercise, of course, unfortunately turned out to be treacherous and turned you over to the enemy. In other words, you were set up for a capture. Now, my group, funny enough, during that exercise all in, we were, of course, set up for capture. And we were trapped in an abandoned mine shaft. And judo with climbing ropes and marched off back to presumably the enemy camp for interrogation, etc. This was in the middle of the night, of course, and it was a very, very dark, pitch black night. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And I do remember marching along, tied one to the other, being escorted by the enemy troops, which of course were SAS troopers. And I had managed to keep a very small, approximately an inch long penknife in my pocket, which they had not found when they searched me. I managed to get this out whilst marching along in the dark and cut my way through the climbing rope. And then just holding the climbing rope loosely around me, I waited for the right moment when there was a little bit of a gap in the escorting soldiers. And I rushed off into a plantation, blindly into a plantation of fir trees, ran for about 50 yards and dived into the ground and lay flat, dead still, hardly breathing. Well, the whole group stopped in some sort of disarray and pandemonium, and the enemy soldiers commenced to search for me, but they never found me. One of them actually stood on my right hand as he walked around looking for me. But eventually he moved off, and I got myself up very cautiously and waited until first light, moved on to the road. I knew where I was and I knew where our next objective had been. So I proceeded to go towards that objective. And on approaching it, I saw the rest of my chaps all sitting around having a good time, drinking cokes and having plenty of food to eat and so on, which we hadn't seen for several days. And they all said, "Come on in, Duffy." I said, "Exercise is over, we passed." Yeah. And there was some directing staff with them who echoed what they had been saying. And I said, "Yeah, come in, Duffy, it's over now." So I didn't want to believe them at first, but I did eventually go over and discovered that the exercise was indeed over and I had passed. And the training officer at the time, Sandy McLean, made a bit of a joke, a bit of a show out of charging me for destroying government property in the form of one climbing rope, and threatened to charge me $40 to replace the climbing rope. Fortunately, he was joking, so that is an amusing little anecdote I recall. Yeah, so then from after exercise all in, we went along to New Serum to the parachute training school. And we had our air experience flight, which was, again, quite interesting for me. I'd always been fascinated by flying, and even if I was only a passenger. And I remember Major Bentley was on board the aircraft for our air experience trip. And he came over to me at one point in the aircraft and looking out the door, he said, "Duffy, how far above the ground do you think we are?" And being a serious question, I looked at it, looked out the door towards the ground. I said, "Sir, I'm not too sure, but I would say about 1,000 feet maybe." And I had no idea what the normal jump height was. Anyway, Major Bentley was quite impressed. He said, "Yes, well done. That's exactly right. This is the height we jump from on training." Yeah, and then we went through 2 weeks of ground training and a further week of actual parachute descents. I think 8 was the minimum we had to complete to pass. We actually did 9 on my, or 10 on my basic course. And I managed to pass that without injury and successfully enough. And thereafter, we had a formal parade at New Serum Air Base, where we were presented with our SAS parachute wings. And of course, we'd by now drawn our SAS berets from the quartermaster as well. So yes, I was accepted as a trooper into the SAS. I was presented my wings, in fact, by General Costa, who at the time was Chief of the Army. And yeah, very proud of the photograph I have of myself accepting my wings from General Costa. And they followed operations in the SAS, starting off with our first real operation, Op Sable, which was partly in the Zambezi Valley and moving into Mozambique to our north, on the lookout for terrorists and their infiltration routes, and trying to gather information about how they were coming in what numbers and so on, and of course to intercept them where possible. At one point, fairly early in Op Sable, we had walked in quite some distance. I remember crossing the Roya River, which was not a huge river, but quite interesting in crossing it, because we were carrying very heavy loads, of course, in our Bergens or our backpacks. We used to call them Bergens, I think, because they were made by Bergen of Norway. And we, of course, had this very heavy equipment, and we had to swim our Bergens across. And the weird thing was that a Bergen that might weigh 80 to 100 pounds actually floats in the water when you put it in. So it's pretty easy to swim it across the river. The operation in Op Sable was really quite an introduction to what was to come, and got us used to going for long periods without fresh rations, for example, getting resupplied anything from a week to 2 weeks apart, which usually also happened by air. In other words, they would drop our resupplies of ammunition and rations and whatever was required, radio batteries, etc. They would drop to us by parachute. And also that particular operation, during that operation, was the first time in my life came under fire from the enemy. I remember the first occasion at the end of a day's march, we stopped to cook up our rations for the evening and have a cup of tea or whatever, before moving on to a lie-up position. And all of a sudden, I remember my friend Brian Jackson was busy digging a hole out in the open to bury our leftover ration tins and packets and so on, which was our habit. We always buried everything. And I was sitting making a cup of tea for the two of us behind a very large tree on the banks of the Roya, when all of a sudden I noticed leaves and twigs falling down around my ears, and it didn't immediately dawn on me, but then I suddenly heard this crackling noise and realized why the leaves were falling down. Bullets going through the tree over us. And Brian Jackson appeared beside me behind this big tree in a blink of an eye from about 20 yards away. Anyway, it was ineffectual fire from some terrorists that had opened up on us. They'd seen us from a very high riverbank about 400 meters away. Well, this was quite big news to us. And the next day, a huge operation was put into effect to follow up on these terrorists and try and track them down. I remember Darrell Watt was leading it as the chief tracker. And we went for a few days looking for these terrorists. We had the Air Force involved too. They called in Air Force at a certain point they'd caught a glimpse of them, or they thought they had, and they brought in some air support in the form of a couple of Provost aircraft, ground attack aircraft. pretty basic, slow-moving aircraft, but armed with 2 30 caliber machine guns and Phantom bombs. And I remember, Willem, you'll remember the chap, the sergeant with glasses. He was in charge of us. And we had set up, we'd been instructed by our commander in I think it was called Telstar aircraft. They used for radio comms. We'd been told to set up as a stop group in a certain position. And waiting for something to happen, which didn't happen from the enemy side, but did happen from the Air Force side. And I could, of course, hear over the sergeant's radio these 2 provost pilots talking to each other. And I remember they'd been zooming around the area, and I suddenly heard the Black 2, this is Black 1, follow me, I'll show you where to drop it. Because Black 1 had already actually dropped his Frantan. Frantan is the Rhodesian homemade form of napalm, of course. So Black 1, I was watching these 2 aircraft from the ground. I watched and I thought, no, surely he's not looking at it. He certainly was. I was lying behind a paper bark tree at the time. And I remember trying to make myself as small as possible and thinking, no, surely he isn't going to be going for us. But yes, Black 1 opened up with his machine guns. Strafed us. Didn't hit anybody, luckily. Pulled out, and there behind him was Black 2 with 2 Frantan bombs under his wings, and he was coming to drop them right on top of us. I remember looking at the engine cowling of that aircraft and thinking, my God, he's going to drop any second. And I shouted and screamed to our sergeant, stop, stop, stop. And he eventually managed to get a gap in the radio comms that were going on and called out, stop, stop, stop. And Black 2 pulled up immediately, fortunately without releasing the napalm. I later heard, it was confirmed by those 2 pilots, that Black 2 had said he was his finger was on a button to drop that napalm when he heard stop. So I very nearly turned into a roast chicken. That gave me quite a shock.
You would have been fried, eh?
Would have actually been roasted completely, fried. Yeah. I can just remember the sight of that engine cowling, and it was virtually on top of us.
But those days, the Portuguese were still in control. Rhodesian forces were inside Mozambique, but it was still Portuguese territory.
That is correct, yes. Yeah. Yeah, you are correct there. But obviously, ZANU, the ZANU forces had set up bases there as well. And the Portuguese were not the greatest at chasing after them. They had their own eggs to fry. And they more or less also stayed in their little base camps or their forward bases and didn't do much patrolling. They weren't very proactive in fighting for Lima, for example.
They didn't look after the rifles either, for those that you met.
They didn't. We met up with a group of them, one of their bases on the northern side of the Zambezi River. And we had a friendly get-together and a chat and comparing each other's weapons and so on. I'll never forget. The one soldier brought his G3 rifle out to show us what they were using and how well it would shoot. But he couldn't cock the thing. Eventually one of our chaps got hold of it, managed to work the magazine off, but he couldn't cock it by hand either. Eventually put the butt on the ground, kicked the cocking lever with his boot, upon which the bolt flew back in a cloud of red rust. They didn't look after their weapons too well.
Yeah,
That same spot, was quite a strange incident happened. As all of a sudden, all these Portuguese soldiers were running to grab their whatever weapon they could find, and all ran out into the open in front of the barrack rooms to open fire on a flock of geese that was flying up the river a couple of 100 yards away. And they let fly with everything they had. And it was made quite an impressive noise. I can assure you not one bird fell out of the sky. And from Ops Able, we went on to do quite a large number of patrolling type ops to gather intelligence on infiltration routes, try and intercept the terrorists. And again, it was Ops Able had been a bit of a warm-up, and they followed quite a long period of long drawn-out operations. At times we were deployed for 3 months at a time in the bush, just being supplied every 2 weeks approximately by air, by parachute. Carrying very hard loads, going without water for very long periods. And then also there were operations involving walking into Mozambique, ambushing terrorists. And one of my favorite exercises, of course, was also returning the landmines they had brought to us in Rhodesia.
There was one particular op that you quite enjoyed, in and out within 24 hours. Eh?
Yes, there was. In fact, we parachuted in on one occasion, and it was always nice to parachute in. I preferred that to walking in. We parachuted in at night at I would say just after dark. Squadron leader de Kock doing the spotting for us by eyeball from the door of the Dakota from 23,000 feet up above the ground. And we parachuted in to intercept a group of terrorists that we had they had information would be moving down towards Mokombura from I think from Tet area, somewhere around there, towards Mokombura. And we duly found the road where it crossed a small stream, and we set up a boosted landmine in the center of the low-level bridge, set up some claymores and waited for them. Early the next morning, along came a truck full of these Zanla terrorists and a couple of camp followers. And yes, well, cut a long story short, we initiated the landmine, blew up the truck on the bridge, mopped up the terrorists, and made our way back to where we had stashed our parachutes and waited for pickup by helicopter. Incidentally, on that jump in, I actually sprained my ankle, so it wasn't very comfortable for me. But we made it back all right to our parachutes, got picked up by helicopter, taken back into Rhodesia and onto vehicles back to Salisbury. 24 hours later, my mates and I had been on the op, we were drinking beer in the round bar in Salisbury.
It was a T4, hey, Mike?
That was the kind of op I enjoyed.
Okay, Mike. That was what you call the 24-hour op, and then at some stage you blew up the whole scenery to quite a loud bang. But before we get to that, you said there are some others, some interesting ops that you did. Tell us about it.
Yeah, a couple of other incidents that I do in Mozambique. And I remember one of them on a walk-in operation into Mozambique, where we were still on the Rhodesian side. We hadn't reached the cordon sanitaire yet. We stopped to sleep for the night, the four of us, my stick. And we could hear a leopard hunting baboons nearby. And it was, again, a very dark night. It was one of those nights where it was very, very dark. Overcast, no starlight even. And we could hear this leopard and these baboons carrying on a couple of 100 yards away from where we had set ourselves down to get a bit of sleep before continuing the walk into Mozambique. And the leopard eventually failed with the baboon hunt. And I can remember hearing this leopard, four of us, a saw cutting through wood, the grunt that they made. And you could hear his breath as he panted as well. And he walked around very, very close around us. We were lying sort of with our heads towards each other, feet outward. And speaking for myself, I had my rifle at the ready with the safety off and just pointing at the sound of this leopard's breathing and following it around. And it was quite nerve-wracking. Anyway, it eventually moved off without incident. But the next morning, we could see his paw prints in the sand, only a few feet away from our feet. That was quite interesting. And another operation we went on when we infiltrated into Zambia with some captured terrorists to guide the chaps into where a suspected cache was. I was on the boat party, transferring the chaps from the Rhodesian side across to the Zambian side in klepper canoes, and I've been tasked with carrying this captured terrorist in my klepper canoe and depositing him on the Zambian side. I was armed with my FN rifle, and I remember being armed with a Webley & Scott 32 auto pistol with a silencer on it in case I needed to deal with the terrorist. Nevertheless, we got the terrorist across and delivered safely without further incident, and I turned my klepper canoe around. And at the time, it was around about January, so in the middle of the rainy season. The river was very wide where we were. I would say it was a good 2-3 kilometers wide, and it was in flood. And outside, where we had arranged to signal each other from the bank to the canoes by pen torches, flashing pen torches with red filters on them. And yeah, we were halfway across the river now, and a massive electrical thunderstorm broke out. And to this day, I don't think I've seen a more violent electrical thunderstorm with severe lightning. And I remember, you'll remember chap Lionel, he was in the canoe behind. But as I looked behind, what did I happen to see? Now, bear in mind, this is the middle of the Zambezi, but a hippopotamus standing halfway out of the water. Obviously, there was a sandbank where we were, so the water was quite shallow because this hippo was halfway up out of the water. Well, I wasn't going to wait for him to see if he would catch me. I turned that canoe to point downstream and paddled as hard as I could. But the result was that I ended up about 3 kilometers downstream on the Rhodesian bank. And I still had to now get back to our party on the Rhodesian bank, which I did by pushing that canoe. It was impossible to paddle it against that current for such a distance. Eventually, I got out of the canoe into the water waist deep and pushed it along the banks of the Zambezi, hoping that I wouldn't meet any crocodiles. And eventually, when I got back close to our launching point, I could see torchlights flashing intermittently. My torch had given up the ghost by now, so I resorted to pulling out matches out of a waterproof plastic bag in my pocket and striking a match now and again and holding it above my canoe as I pushed it from the back, and hoping like anything that the chaps wouldn't see matches and think it was odd and then open fire on me. Fortunately, they were sensible and they didn't, and I made it back. But that was very scary for me because I was quite concerned about the possibility of being taken by a croc as I walked my canoe along. It would have been impossible for me to drag it back otherwise. Yeah, anyway, we got back. The operation was carried out. I think that was actually a lemon. I don't think they actually found the arms cache they were looking for at the end of it. Yeah, then we went on to bigger and better operations.
So, Mike, now you'll probably tell us how you blew up half of Zambia.
Yeah, well, that's a bit of an exaggeration, Willem, but certainly it was something which was right up my alley. I'd always been interested in the demolitions aspect, and I'd done an advanced demolitions course. So I was on the demolition team for Big Bang. Intelligence had suggested, and it had been confirmed by aerial photography, that Zipper had set up a big underground arms cache in Zambia. We deployed to the northwest of Rhodesia and set up a forward base. Little did we know, we had actually been seen by terrorists from the Zambian side. But at any rate, we went ahead and did a river crossing into Zambia. Quite a large party of us, and I still remember each man was tasked to carry 40 pounds of plastic explosive, as well as his normal supplies for a day, a few days worth of operating. It was a walk-in, and from the time that we deployed and arrived at that forward base on the Zambezi River to the time that we got back, I recall was about 72 hours, during which time we had no sleep, any of us that went over to Zambia. So that was pretty tough. But to get back to the operation, we crossed over the river at night, we walked into the target, set up stop groups. Assault team went in, assaulted this camp.
Okay, Mike, so you shook out and you assaulted the camp. You assaulted the camp, take it from there?
Yes, yeah. The assault went through and we captured the camp. One of the terrorists I recall seeing running down the riverbed into our stop group. He was eliminated. And we then went to look for the underground bunker, which we found. And entered to arm, I would say, a battalion-sized force. as well as large quantities of explosives and landmines. And as it turned out, we needn't have bothered carrying our own explosives in. There was enough there of their own to do the job. I think we estimated roughly that the pure content of the explosives in that underground bunker by weight was approximately 3.5 tons. That is only explosive, not the casings or anything. So yes, we set up our charges. I was part of the 4-man demolition team, and we retreated to a safe distance, or what we hoped was a safe distance. As it turned out, I think I'd only allowed about 2 minutes to get away from it before it went up, which it did with a mighty bang. I remember turning around, and we all lay down and waited a few seconds before it would go. I remember seeing a thin column of white shoot up into the sky, followed by massive amounts of dust, debris, smoke, etc., and a screaming, whistling noise of large pieces of concrete flying through the air, which then began to drop all about and around us as well. The blast wave was quite impressive too. And apparently people in Wankie and Det had heard that explosion, and they would have had to have been at least 60 odd miles away from it. So it was a very, very big bang indeed, and hence the operation was very appropriately named. The explosion caused a crater to the course of 2 streams that flowed into a confluence around this arms cache. Yeah, they did aerial photography afterwards, and they saw the course of one of the rivers had changed due to that explosion. And we then had the task of walking back and recrossing the river back into Rhodesia, which all in all, by the time we got back there, it took us about 72 hours. And I can assure you it is very difficult to stay alert for 72 hours. Nonetheless, yeah. What had happened in the meantime, what had transpired was that our forward base on the Rhodesian side had been attacked by some of the terrorists from the camp that we had just blown up. They had seen us when we moved into our forward base, apparently, and a couple of them had sneaked over and sprayed the camp with machine gun automatic rifle fire, actually wounding 2 of our people in the party, Dudley Walls and Willie Erasmus, I think it was.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was a bit of a downer that they'd had to go at us. But we destroyed their camp and everybody in it on their side. So it was a very successful operation, and it set back Zebra for a long, long time in their efforts. Further operations I can bring to mind were ops into Mozambique, where we attacked the town of Kyoko. I was on the first Kyoko attack. There was another one later, but where we attacked it and disguised the attack scenario as if we were Renamo dissidents, leaving notes behind us in Portuguese and so on. We basically just shot the camp up, mortared them, and then moved out. I do remember being mortared in return on our way back. They eventually got themselves pulled together and opened up on us with 82mm mortars, and one bomb probably landed about 100 yards from me. was quite impressive to see this great geyser of dust and smoke, and obviously a very loud bang. So they had pretty accurately guessed our line of flight, as it were. Anyway, they did no harm to us, and we pushed off from that. But there followed other operations into Mozambique. There were many. Floating our equipment across the Rio River was a common thing. We often went across and returned the landmines that the terrorists had laid in Rhodesia, which had been recovered. Well, we always liked to return them back to where they belonged. We did that on one occasion. I remember returning a landmine on the Tet Road. We stayed and waited for a week, but it run out of water. So at the final day, we decided to head back. We were on our way back out that night when we heard a bang in the distance, and we thought, at last. Somebody's found. Turned out from intelligence intercept.
So you heard the mine. You heard the mine on the way back. So
yes, intelligence intercepts, or gather radio intercepts, confirmed that a ZANU area commander and one of his pals from Frelimo, a major, had been taken out in a Land Rover. Again, that was a successful operation, a very thirsty one, going for a week with very minimal water towards the end of it. But anyway, yeah, we got back. We got a resupply on the way out. Resupply of water parachuted to us from a Trojan. And yeah, we made it back. So there were a lot of similar sort of operations that we did, Willem, before we got into the major camp attacks that we started getting. After PK van der Bijl was made Minister of Defense, and we started being given more latitude to indulge in bigger operations. An op that comes to mind that I recall vividly was the first attack on Mapai in the southeast, inside Mozambique, through the southeast of Rhodesia, where we took out the communist terrorist camp in Mapai. The ground fire from the enemy against our aircraft.
Mike, Mapai was on the Russian front. We called it the Russian front. Why was that?
That's right. Yeah, because of the Russian support of the Frelimo, I suppose. But yeah, the first attack we did on Mapai, I was involved in, where we took out the communist terrorist base camp there at Mapai. We walked into Mozambique. We set up stop groups around it, and the attack itself was initiated. It was precise timing. I believe it was initiated by Pete Allen and company with some mortar fire, which had to stop precisely at a certain moment because an airstrike came in. I remember the airstrike was carried out in the main. I think it was by, we had 2 hunters and 2 vampires. I can't remember for certain, but I do remember the vampires very clearly. I remember watching them coming in to strafe the enemy camp positions and the anti-aircraft positions, firing back at them. And the 14.5 millimeter anti-aircraft traces going up towards the vampires looked like great big green footballs to my mind, I was well used to seeing small arms fire with tracer, but the 14.5s are quite impressive. They look like footballs. And I remember watching this one particular vampire dipping his wings left and right, in between. It seemed almost uncanny the way his wings were going in between the tracer rounds. And of course, he soon silenced the anti-aircraft position. So yes, we assaulted the main camp. We took that out, and then our troop commander at the time, Bob Mack, who you'll remember well, deployed me by helicopter to go and flush out a couple of terrorists that had been spotted by one of the aircraft trying to get away from the camp. I was duly dropped off by helicopter with my stick to try and flush these couple of terrorists out. We walked through, there was one particular area that I thought was very suspicious looking. I called in a K-car strike onto it, but nothing came of that. So we moved further up onto a ridge line. And I recall walking along through fairly open ground with very thick clumps of Jesse bush here and there. One of which, as we approached, I moved to my right-hand side of this bush. Couldn't see anything inside the bush. It was, very thick foliage, thick, heavy green foliage. But it was literally only a couple of meters to the side of me, and all of a sudden a burst of AK fire came around me, so close that I could feel the pressure waves from the bullets going past me. And what had happened was I had not seen a terrorist lying under this Jesse bush, and he had opened fire on me from about perhaps 3-4 meters away, not much less, on full automatic fire. But fortunately for me, my machine gunner, Gordon Kuma, to my left, had also seen him and fired at him probably milliseconds before he fired at me. And Gordon's bullets had knocked him off his aim. And that was probably the closest I'd ever come to moving into the next world. In fact, Gordon's bullets kicked up sand that I remember. The sand coming up from Gordon's burst of fire actually stung and drew blood on the left-hand side of my forearm, on my left arm. I had jumped probably about 10 feet in the air, and I'd emptied half of my magazine into this terrorist as well by the time I landed. But Gordon had done the job for me and probably saved my life by spotting him just that fraction of a second before he would have most certainly killed me. So yeah, that was a bit of a close shave on that occasion. We captured a lot of equipment and a lot of documentation, all of which was taken back, handed on to Special Branch. And yeah, we moved back to Salisbury.
You were leading a charmed life at that stage, eh?
I think I was. It wasn't the only brush I'd had with the Grim Reaper either. I remember earlier in one of our walk-in operations in Mozambique, it was a long 2 or 3 months extended OP operation, observation in Mozambique, and I contracted cerebral malaria. And we'd walked back in. We were using Macombi Aldamento. This was when the Portuguese were still there. We had walked back into this Macombi forward base. and I came down with this malaria as we arrived at the base. And our dear friend, recently departed friend, Andy Johnson, was the medic. And he obviously took a good look at me and examined me and diagnosed, and I was going down so rapidly. He actually told our commander at the time, Brian Robinson, he said, "Sir, you better get this man back to Salisbury immediately, if not sooner, because if you don't, he's going to die." Well, Robinson took him at his word and obviously contacted ComOps. ComOps authorized a Dakota specifically to casevac me from Mokombe. They flew a DAC, especially from Salisbury to Mokombe, to casevac me. After which I spent about a week in the RLI hospital, and I can barely remember anything of that time. But I survived. But I think I very nearly died from malaria. So from bullets to malaria, you name it. Wild animals, the occasional charge by a grumpy elephant in Rhodesia. Fortunately, only a mock charge, but yeah. Interesting times, Willem. Very interesting times.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier on Zipra and then Zanna again. Just tell us a bit about
Well,
two fronts war.
Zipra was basically Joshua Nkomo's crowd of terrorists who operated chiefly out of Zambia. Zanla, with the ZANU faction under Mugabe, that was operating chiefly out of Mozambique into Rhodesia. And Zipra and ZANU formed the Patriotic Front eventually. ZAPU and ZANU formed the Patriotic Front, which eventually took over Rhodesia when the West sold us down the river.
Yeah, and then Chimoya came along, but you had left by that time to the PTS.
Willem, yes, Willem in well, let me just point out that in 1976 I met a wonderful lady and got married to her. I'm still married to her now. And in 77, the parachute training school was struggling to keep up the supply of adequately trained parachutists. I had always loved parachuting and anything to do with flying. And I duly volunteered to be trained as a parachute jumping instructor, attached from the Army to the Air Force Parachute Training School. So I moved over to New Salem in 1977, qualified as a PJI, parachute jump instructor, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I trained Fire Force troops. As many of your listeners will be aware, we had a formidable Fire Force system operating against the terrorists with great success. We trained elements of the Rhodesian Light Infantry, the Rhodesian African Rifles, the Zulu Scouts, and of course my parent unit, the SAS, and other odds and sods occasionally along the way, including such characters as the Devil Dodger, Padre Bill Blakeway. I personally trained Colonel Orst, the CEO, the late CEO of the RLI, in his parachuting course. I had great fun. It was a great team of people at the parachute school with a wonderful sense of humor. They were all as funny as anything. I could tell you a few stories about that too. For example, John Boynton introducing a new basic static line course, was asked at the end of a lecture, shortly before the showing of a standard parachute training film, by one of the soldiers was asked if he minded whether they smoked, and John Boynton replied, "Son, I don't care if you burst into flames." So, that was the sort of sense of humor they had. I remember another occasion on a basic course, a young troopie, all these young troopies coming into the lecture room to watch the training film, and the screen was down in front of the blackboard. There was a blackboard at the head of the lecture room with a projection screen in front of it. And Mike Wiltshire would come in and flip the projector screen so that it would roll back up and expose on the board. And there, written in huge block capitals with white chalk, was the slogan, "Death kills," with a big exclamation mark.
Yeah,
And this is
Mike Wilson was a comic, eh? Yeah.
this, of course, got some weird expressions from the students. But we had a pretty dark sense of humor. I'm talking about in the SAS too. During the war, we developed such a dark sense of humor. I think we had to cope with the ugly side, which was never far away.
You mentioned Fire Force. Give us a bit of an idea from the PJI's point of view. In other words, from the air, from the guys who threw the parachutists out.
Yes. Well, for example, we were obviously involved on the Chimoio operation as well. The famous operation took out a very large terrorist camp in Chimoio, and I was in the doorway as the #1 dispatcher of one of the Dakota aircraft, having dropped our SAS boys. And I'd seen the whole thing with the Hunter airstrikes going in, watching the Hunters out. It was a real sight to see. Hunter strikes always impressed me. I remember watching them from the ground, and you'd see this black dart turn in, come down towards its target, and then a big red, bright scarlet red flame would come out under its nose and trail all the way back to the tailpipe of the aircraft. Absolutely silent, and then you would hear a sound like heavy canvas being ripped, like as the rounds came past, and then you of course hear the explosions as they hit the ground, and it was an incredible sight and sound. Always impressed me. And those Hunters are a formidable aircraft. 4 30mm Aden cannons in the nose, 1,200 rounds delivered in 5 seconds in a continual burst. A very dangerously formidable weapon if you're on the wrong end. So yes, watching the attack on Chimoio from the door of Dakota was quite something, I can assure you. Lots of aircraft buzzing around, lots of smoke and fire on the ground. Quite wonderful. And of course, being in the parachute training school, then we were involved all the time on Fire Force operations. And a couple of us were always out deployed on Fire Forces at Grand Reef, Matoko, Fort Vic, so on, and so on. And we'd spend about 3 weeks at a time deployed on Fire Force, dropping either RAR or RLI mostly into contacts with the enemy.
You must have
And
seen. You must have
yeah, our boys were very brave fighters, right? And let me tell you, you jump out of an aircraft at 500 feet. It takes some guts. That's like you don't have much chance if something goes wrong with your parachute. You haven't really got much time to deploy a reserve parachute. But these guys did it. I always take my hat off to them. I think the lowest I ever jumped out of an aircraft as a PJI even was about 500 feet, and it's close. It's pretty scary because you think your parachute won't have time to open.
What was the basic idea of the fire force? You know, the Dakota especially. How did the Dakotas come in?
Basically, it was the development, Willem. The basic idea was that an observation point, an observation post would pick up by sight or whatever a terrorist presence, and they would call in the fire force and radio in the grid reference of the enemy position. The fire force would be scrambled, which consisted of Alouette helicopters, one a K-car, which is a gunship, and usually at about 4 or 5 G-cars or troop carriers, plus a Dakota with parachutists, paratroops. They would fly out and try to surround the enemy and obviously attack them. And if the enemy managed to escape in any particular direction, the Dakota was able to drop a stick of paratroopers to cut them off, or drop perhaps a whole load of paratroops to sweep through an area and flush out the terrorists and kill them. It was an extremely successful concept, and it was much admired by international forces afterwards too, and copied, I've no doubt.
But there must have been casualties. You must have seen some of those casualties flying them out back.
Yes, Willem, casualties always are in war, and that's something to deal with. From my own point of view, I quite often had to deal with losing good friends. Something very difficult to have to do and to deal with. I've attended far too many military funerals at a young age. And yeah, the casualties themselves, when it's your own people, it's very, very difficult. What I also found interesting, and something that was totally alien to me in my early years in the army, was actually just to see a dead human being. It's never pleasant. It has a peculiar smell to it. And the process of decay of a human body is very rapid in the height of summer, I can assure you. It is the most unpleasant side of war.
And flying the wounded back, you must have done that lots of times in the Dakota.
On the odd occasion, yes. I think, as I mentioned, I myself was casevaced one time with malaria, cerebral malaria. Very nearly died. But yes, we did occasionally have to fly casualties back to Salisbury for treatment for more serious wounds. I would say not that often that I was involved in that, but occasionally was on board the aircraft. Yeah.
So the war carried on and eventually came to an end. You stayed on, or you were there when everything changed, eh?
I was still there, Willem. I actually retired at the end of 1980, and after 10 years service in total in the regular Defence Force of Rhodesia. I retired. My wife and I had a young daughter at that point, and I could not see any point in remaining in Zimbabwe under Mugabe's regime. And I didn't think it was the right choice. So we emigrated back to South Africa, to where my parents were born. And we ended up back in Pietermaritzburg.
But before you went down, you had to listen to a briefing, I believe, by General Walls.
Yes,
He told you.
yes, not many people might be aware, but there was up to a point that just before the elections, the so-called election of Mugabe and his party into power, there was talk of the military kicking the tin over and basically taking out all these terrorists, as we still felt that they were. They'd all been nicely grouped for us. But then Walls came along and gathered us all together at the Paris School at New Serum and informed us that there would be no such operation, and that we would go ahead with an election. And we all know what happened after that. Mugabe and his cronies took over the country and proceeded to thoroughly wreck it and ruin it.
You can say that again. You can say that
Yeah.
again.
Yes.
And yourself? What happened after? How did your
Oh,
life go?
we upstick and we took off. I had actually been on a short holiday down south to the Transkei coast and met up with a chap who was living in Pietermaritzburg, who was a keen fisherman like myself, and he offered me an apprenticeship in his small refrigeration business. So when we moved down to South Africa, I took a major apprenticeship up with Sid Millington, and I duly qualified as a refrigeration and air conditioning, commercial refrigeration and air conditioning mechanic. As Sid Millington said to me, he was quite a joking sort of character at one stage. He said, "Well, Mike, I've taught you everything I know, and you still know bugger all." So I worked for a few different refrigeration contractors in Pietermaritzburg, and then I was employed by a mechanical engineering consultant as an inspector of works as such. And I ended up eventually, I worked for them for 7 or 8 years and looked after all the maintenance and emergency repair work of all fixed mechanical equipment for the KwaZulu government. That was prior to 94, the old KwaZulu government. And yeah, from there I went back into contracting, worked there for a few years, and then started my own contracting business in Pietermaritzburg in refrigeration and air conditioning.
But that didn't last.
Sorry?
That didn't last long, or it didn't last forever.
No, I worked on my own for another eight years or so. But by then the ANC had taken over the government, and it was very difficult now to get government contracts or municipal contracts, even with all the BEE nonsense, and very difficult to get payment on time. And eventually I thought, no, to hell with this, I'll chuck it in. And I'd been told about opportunities in the security business overseas. So I'd actually applied for a post with a British company called Olive Security in Iraq. This was after Desert Storm, just after Desert Storm. And yeah, I got a contract with them stationed in Basra, protecting people and assets on power regeneration equipment. The client was GEC. And yeah, from then on, I had occasional other all short-term contracts, and worked for Edinburgh International at one point. Then I got in with Osprey Asset Management, which was our mutual old friend John Gartner. He was the boss at the time. Worked for John in Iraq as well. Contract with the Iraqi elections in Baghdad, riding convoys of election materials and assets around Baghdad on Route Irish, which is always fun. Route Irish at the time was considered the most dangerous road in the world. Anyway, we did that. And we saw through the successful elections, Iraqi elections, for the IECI, which was the client. And then later moved on to security contract in Afghanistan for a USAID contractor. Again, they were involved in the reconstruction of the power grid infrastructure in Afghanistan and maintenance of existing power plants and new power plants. Did that for about 3 years in Afghanistan. Very interesting time. I ended up in Afghanistan in charge of the security for the company in country. I was a security director in country, and I had in my employ several expat team leaders and close to 300 Ministry of Interior seconded troops, which we had a memorandum of understanding that we employed. So they came along all equipped with their weapons and everything that they needed. We had a fleet of about 60 vehicles, of which I think 2 or 3 were armored. The rest of them were all soft-skinned vehicles. And I spent most of my time in Afghanistan in the Helmand province in Kandahar city. Some of the time in Kabul, of course, which is where we were headquartered. But Kandahar was my posting. That was a pretty hot area there too. It was a most interesting time being exposed to all the assets that the Americans and the Brits and the Dutch and everyone had deployed there. Very interesting time.
Do you think they were winning the war at that stage? How do you rate the Taliban, for example?
We actually were never unfortunate enough to have any bad incidents during my time in Afghanistan while I was in charge. The company, we had no losses of assets or personnel due to terrorist action, partly because I think we had an excellent plan in place. Other than on one occasion, I must remember that on one occasion, one of our armored vehicles, excuse me, one of our armored vehicles was shot up when it was on its way to collect me from a meeting one evening in Kampvuur, where presumably a Taliban character stepped out of an alley with a PKM machine gun and opened fire on the car as it went past. It failed to disable the car. Of course, being an armored car, no rounds even penetrated the shell of the car. But it did cost a few $1,000s to have it repaired. Other than that, no losses of assets or personnel. So the company, I think, overall, was duly impressed with our security setup.
Okay, Mike, but all of you who worked there in Iraq and Afghanistan, you were basically foreigners there. How did you interact with the locals and how did you see them?
Well, we found generally, Willem, that the locals were only too happy to have us come along because now they got paid regularly, a good wage, and they were very willing to work and assist and basically to rebuild their countries as well. I'm quite sure that they appreciated the value that they were getting, particularly I would say in Afghanistan, where the company I worked for there, rebuilding the electrical infrastructure, we were very much appreciated, I think. And that partly might also be why we received not as much attention from the Taliban and the dissidents of the country.
Although it was a hotspot. I mean, Kandahar and Helmand have always been hot, dangerous.
Yes, it was indeed. Yeah. There were constantly IEDs going off, and IED being an improvised explosive device. One had to always be alert for this sort of thing as well. So it was certainly a dangerous place, but as I say, we always had a good plan. We were never predictable. We never let ourselves be open to easy attack, for want of better words. So we didn't make ourselves easy targets. And I found that the troops, certainly the troops that were seconded to us from the Ministry of Interior in Afghanistan were a great bunch of guys. Sometimes a bit of a scruffy looking lot, indeed, almost a ragtag bunch, but quite professional and certainly disciplined. So it was a pleasure working with them. In fact, I'm still in contact with the chap I would call my captain of the Ministry of Interior troops, Amanullah Khan. He is now in America. He got through his work, his later working for the Americans. He found a way to get into America and get a green card. So he's now living in America, and I'm still in contact with him. A great guy. Very nice chap. In fact, him and his very good friend as well, Shreen, is also there. So they did. If you were an Afghani and you worked well and you helped the Americans, you had a possible route to a green card, and I'm glad for them.
Yeah, but it probably meant that that their own country lost some good people.
I think so too. Yes, I think that is always the case. But yeah, there were certainly some very good people. There were also some absolute rubbish as well.
Like everywhere.
Like everywhere, yeah.
But then you basically came back, and then you went to another.
Then I moved back to West Africa, Willem.
Yeah.
I headed up to West Africa, and again with my old friend John Gartner, his company Osprey Asset Management. I was offered a job in Sierra Leone, which I took up, and I ended up working in Sierra Leone for about 3 years, and part of that time was also spent in Guinea-Conakry, where our client also had offices in Conakry. Mining exploration company on this occasion. Spent about 3 years in Sierra Leone. All in all, obviously with the occasional R&R trip back home. And yeah, it was an interesting time.
What was the work like?
It was pretty good. In Sierra Leone, there I had an unarmed security guard force, but they were very professional, in the main ex-police and military types.
Unarmed?
Unarmed, yes. This was after the Sierra Leone troubles, and we were working for a mining exploration company. So I was in charge of the security guard force there. Again with a few expat lieutenants and a largely local or entirely local security guard force. I had an interesting experience there too at one time. As generally in Africa, the people tend to be pretty unpredictable and they can be pretty wild. And they would form protest mobs very quickly. So the client company on one occasion, the accountant had decided that we had to close down an operation in a certain part of the country. And rather than convey the news himself, he tasked me with informing the guard force at this location, it was a place called Kukuna, that they were going to be no longer employed.
Oops.
Yeah, so I duly had to go up there with my security guards, unarmed, and break this sad news to them, to which they did not take kindly.
I can imagine.
Yeah, so the things were getting very heated, and my security guards, they said to me, "Sir, we better go and lock ourselves up in that, there's a pretty well-reinforced security room in the grounds, and we lock up in there." And they had somehow got a message through to the nearest police station. And of course, and we had called for reinforcements from our main base. While they were coming along, the police dispatched a couple of vehicles with some seriously armed people with AKs and tear gas and riot gear and everything to rescue us. By this time, the crowd had been stoning this building and all baying for our blood. It was a bit hairy. Anyway, the cops arrived and settled things down, and the local mayor came out as well and spoke to the aggrieved people, and things gradually settled down and abated, and we made our way out of there with a dash of speed.
Then you made a turn in Mali as well, eh? You got around.
Yes, yeah. Ended up working in Mali as well, at a gold mine, Australian gold mine at Syama. went in there as a security assistant security manager, if you like. Me and our old friend Nick, ex-squadron boy as well, and we were looking after security off mine. In other words, transit to and from the mine and external to the mine. They had their own internal security unit as well. That was also good fun. Got to see a lot of the countryside in Mali. We regularly drive from Bamako to the mine, to Siama. I got to really appreciate the good points of the vehicles we were driving. I better not mention the name of the vehicle, but it's a very common vehicle in South Africa too. Four-wheel drive vehicle, because the roads in Mali are something to see, I can assure you.
Yeah.
As soon as you get off the main roads, my word, what fun.
But tell me, Mike, one thing that I've noticed, and it puzzles me a bit, everywhere in Africa, well, even in Afghanistan, you can excuse to a certain extent, but Africa, they've been independent for over 60 years. They chucked all the Frenchmen and Brits and everyone who was there, they chucked them out. They wanted to be on their own and so on. But 60 years later, they still need, well, apparently need people like you, foreigners, to come and run the security. And I know someone else who was an electrician in Mali. Why is that?
Leadership, Willem, they need leadership, because I've always found that without good leadership, it falls into a system of warlords or corrupt, power-hungry officials that don't actually do anything other than loot the place or take advantage of their positions. And that's why infrastructure tends to suffer.
And the investments, the gold mines and so on.
Yes, who wants to invest in a place where you know everything's just going to get looted?
Yeah. But Mike, I never knew. You told me about it just now, and it was quite a shock to me. But it's maybe a good thing that you speak about it, because it just shows up all these years, decades actually, of work that you did and so many blokes on the border did, does take its toll. You had, at one stage, you had a bit of a health problem, right?
Yeah. It was towards the end of my working in Mali. I came back from leave, and I was busy trying to send a text to my partner back in Mali, and I'd just come back from the rifle range. I'd been out shooting on the rifle range. I remember it was a Saturday afternoon, and I thought I'd better text Nick and find out what the arrangements are about my flights being confirmed and so on to go back. And all of a sudden, my finger would not work properly on my phone. I couldn't press the little buttons, and was nonplussed. I thought, what is going on here? My hand was not just waving around. I couldn't control it.
No pain.
No pain, no funniness. I thought, I wonder if I pinched a nerve or something, because I can't seem to control my arm properly. Well, to cut a long story short, Willem, I'd had a minor stroke. Well, they say it was a mild stroke, and it took a couple of days for it to sink in that I better get to hospital.
Yeah.
too late already. My right arm was paralyzed. Yeah, I went into hospital on the Monday morning. They did CT scan and the other scan, whatever it's called. And they said, "Oh, Mr. Ravi, you've had a stroke." And I couldn't believe it. I thought, oh, well, in a few days I'll get over this.
Were you fit?
Yeah, I had no idea what was involved in a stroke. But yeah, I ended up with my right arm and hand paralyzed. It was just like a piece of rubber hanging off my shoulder. But I refused to accept that, so I spent quite a bit of money on physiotherapy. After my pathetic little medical aid allowance of it finished, spent a lot of money of my own doing physio and occupational therapy. I refused to stop using my arm. I'd been left this very slight movement in a couple of my fingers, and I worked on that and I worked it back. And I am not one to give up easily or say, well, that's it, I can't do anything more. And I pushed it and I pushed it and I pushed it, and I worked and I exercised, and everything I tried to do using my right hand or my right arm somehow. And the neurosurgeon that had treated me said, you might get some improvement up till maybe 2 years. After that, forget it. She lied. She was not telling the truth, because I still got improvement. Even now today, sometimes I find it a little bit easier to work with my fingers or my hand, and I've got almost full use of my arm and hand back.
Yeah.
By simply not giving up, and I've rebuilt the neural pathways, whatever had to be done, and I've regained almost all use of my arm and my hand.
Was that just exercise that did it?
Mental determination and exercise, yeah. I'm forcing myself to make the hand work, make the arm work.
Good. Well done, Mike. Take my hat off to you.
I worked on it so hard, I was even at home, I was still repairing refrigerators in my to get some money in as well. And I would load and carry refrigerators on my truck, and I'd carry my welding equipment with my right arm, carry heavy gas bottles with my right arm, deliberately to make it work. So much so that I developed what they call adhesive capsulitis, or frozen shoulder in the right shoulder. And I had to have an operation and keyhole surgery in Pietermaritzburg to fix that as well. But yeah, I've got it mostly back to normal now.
In the meantime, most of your kids also went overseas. Huh?
2 of them did, Willem. Our eldest daughter, who is a solicitor here in the UK, her and her husband moved over, probably 12 years or so ago. Our eldest son, Sean, who is an IT security specialist and technician, he's over here now and working as a self-employed contractor. And our youngest son is still in South Africa, and he is working for a large insurance group in Pietermaritzburg. So yeah, the 3 of them have all done very well. We hope that the younger son will be reunited with us one of these days.
But you've moved in with your 2 of your kids plus your grandson.
No, we've got our own flat here in the UK, my wife and I, but we are in the same village as our eldest son and his family, with their 2 children. So we've got 2 grandchildren here as well.
That's nice.
And of course, a couple of my old friends around too, as you know, or Paul is one of them. We occasionally meet up with Paul, which is always handy because then we can go to Bisley to do a bit of shooting.
So you still following your hobby?
Yes, Willem, I had to leave behind all my firearms when I came to the UK. Of course, it would be a huge rigmarole to try and import them. So I got rid of all my firearms. I had quite a few. That has been my life's passion, probably, firearms and shooting, sport shooting. And yeah, I was a registered and certified collector of firearms and ammunition in South Africa. But yeah, I don't think at this stage of my life I'm going to get back into it, but I do still like to go to the range occasionally and fire a few shots off.
Were you also a good shot, do you reckon?
Oh yes, I was a good shot back in school days. I was in the school shooting team, and when I joined the army. It didn't take me very long to qualify for my marksman badge. I was always a good shot. I remember one day at the rifle range at Kariba in Rhodesia, we had a couple of captured 75mm recoilless rifles there, which, as some of the listeners might not know, is basically it's a cannon that when it fires, a lot of the blast goes out the back to counteract the recoil. So we were firing this thing at the Kariba range, and of course the officers are always the first to get to fire it, and then it went down through the ranks. Then the senior NCOs, then a couple of corporals, and finally they said, "We've got 1 round for one of you troopies to fire. Who's it going to be?" And they were firing, and the target was on a rock face at the end of the rifle range, and it was like a little cave, like a split in the rock, very small, probably no more than about 4 or 5 feet wide. And no one had hit it, no officer, no NCO. So they had 1 round left. They said, "Which of you troopies is going to fire it?" The troopies all sat on one side there, and they were all looking at each other. And then with one voice they said, "Duffy." They all just said, "Duffy," because I was known. I was probably one of the best shots in the unit. So I got this 75mm, and the round that I had to fire was actually an anti-tank round with a tracer in it. So you could see the projectile in flight. And I looked at this, and everybody had missed the target. Everyone. So one of the NCOs or officers had said to me, "Well, Duffy, what do you think the range is?" I looked at it, and I looked through the sight. I looked again from outside the sight. I said, "I think that's 1,150 meters." So I said, "Okay, fine, fire. Who's your number 2? So I got some bloke to come and load it. And he stood on one side of the breech because you don't stand behind that weapon or you'll get roasted. And got the sight graticules fixed on the target. I calibrated it to 1150. Pressed the button. Bang! Off went the projectile with this bright pink tracer coming out the back. And the whole squadron was watching it in flight, and went shook and disappeared inside that little cave. Boom! Perfect shot into the cave. I loved that.
Mike, on that wonderful note, we'll come to the end of it. Thanks very, very much that you spoke to us. I think it was, well, I really enjoyed it, listening to you.
Well, thank you very much, Willem, and thank you to all the listeners. I hope it wasn't too uninteresting for you all.
Yeah, I'm sure it wasn't. I'm sure it was very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. And I hope all goes well for you, and that you still have many nice years ahead of you.
All right. Go well, and all the very best to you and your family.
Thanks, Mike.
And all the very best to everyone in South Africa. And I hope things improve.
Thanks, Mike. Ja, luisteraars, dis die einde van vanaand se om die kampvuur en vir u ook 'n lekker aand, lekker slaap. En ons sien mekaar weer as alles goed gaan volgende week.